announce. The panel is called The More Creative, the More Effective, and I think that's a brilliant question because it directly correlates to our industry. Creativity leads to effectiveness in advertising. This is the mantra of agencies and the results of hundreds of surveys. But is this true in every case? Is there something like an ideal level of creativity? What can we learn from the creative effectiveness category of the Cannes Lions? I think it's quite interesting, so please welcome on stage Franziska Knoefel. She is Director Product Development at Weischer, and she will be our host. Thanks a lot.
I know, quite over time, but I also know it's worth staying here and listening to the people I invite now with me on stage, because I can definitely not answer that question. So first, Timon Seidelmann, Manager Creative Excellence at Ipsos. Please come up on stage with me. Then you just heard him asking a question. Now he will answer my question. Harjot Singh, he's Global Chief Strategy Officer at McCann and McCann Worldgroup, and he was also the jury president of the Creative-Effectiveness-Kategorie Lions jury this year. So welcome up on stage. And last but not least, Thomas Slide. He's Category Director at Mintel Germany. Okay, this was a day full of effectiveness, and I also know that when it comes to this term, and especially effectiveness in marketing, almost everyone has a different understanding to it. So that everyone gets to know a little bit of your daily work and what you do. So first, please answer me the question, what does effective mean to you in your daily work? Maybe you want to start?
Yes, sure, why not? Basically, what effective means for me and for us when we do research on creative is tying very nicely back to what we discussed in the very beginning, in the very first panel. What we always need to understand is what's the goal of the creative piece, what's the goal of the advertisement that we have in front of us. We, of course, have some KPIs that are universal, like attention, branding, short-term impact, long-term impact, but without really understanding what's the strategic idea behind it, what's the goal that this communication is set out to do, we can't really measure the effectiveness.
It's not really that difficult for us as well, because my way of really explaining it and understanding it is very simple. Does it deliver the result against the objectives it's seeking to deliver results against? So it's really about one word, it's about impact. And in terms of creative and creativity, the other more elaborate lens on effectiveness is, does it create value for the brand over time? Does it? So if your work has the propensity to create value and deliver impact, then that work is effective.
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up that saying, I mean, Mintel is short for market intelligence, right? So it's going to be no surprise that for us, it really comes down to does it achieve those business goals? You know, there's lots of ways in which we've seen today how you can measure the effectiveness of a campaign, but when it comes down to it, what were the business goals underlying this, and has it moved the dial for that business in terms, whether it be brand awareness, whether it be increasing sales, whatever that goal is actually, has it changed that in the market? And I think that's for us what counts as effective.
And the other word we have in the title for the panel, Harjot, is also creativity. And from my standpoint, I would say it's really hard to measure if something is creative, isn't it? Isn't it more what I feel when I see something?
That's really that's the challenge. It's so abstract, and yet it's so real at the same time. And I think I just love what Anil said in his talk about this. Is it new, is it surprising, and is it valuable? And I think that, to me, is really the linchpin of the whole thing. So if you can establish beyond reasonable doubt that what you're putting out there, by way of a product, by way of an approach, by way of any kind of stimulus, is new and surprising because it helps you either readjust or expand your understanding or expectations of what is possible and is valuable, then that is considered as being creative. Because without that, I think sometimes, we can, I said that in Cannes as well, and you were in the audience. I said, this is not an art show. Because a lot of times we think of creativity, you have to have a point of view. You have to have some level of value that you're hoping and aspiring to create through that. If you can kind of, be very clear in communicating that and asserting that, the work is creative. Otherwise, it's just artistic expression. And so yes, the two often get convoluted. But it is possible to measure it, and I think that we're going to get into that, right?
Yeah, definitely, especially with Timon and Thomas next to you.
Exactly.
But what I see is when the creators are working and they're brainstorming, they want to come up with ideas. As you said, they want to create value, they need to bring return on invest. And then they reach out to Thomas and Timon, for example. So with what you guys do, could you measure creativity, or is it more that you guys measure what's going on in the world, what's the zeitgeist at the moment? Can you help creatives to be more creative and to measure creativity at first?
Yes, I'll pick that first. So from Mintel's perspective, we're there really at the start of that process, right? So we go back 50 years. We've been covering markets in depth. We have analysts constantly keeping on top of what's going on in these markets, running surveys. We have trend watchers all over the world looking at what's going on at the broader picture, right? We have this huge amount of data. Which we pull together through AI, and we've got our sort of chatbot which allows people to kind of access all of that huge amount of information about what's going on in those markets, what's happening around the world, what's trending, what's not. And then actually that's put at the fingertips of agencies, of people working on these projects. What that means is they can constantly, so they don't have to go out and kind of run that research. You don't have to go and check out that idea, run that, spend a few days to come back and see whether it worked. Actually, you can constantly test those hypotheses. You can constantly type into Leap, our chatbot, and ask it about what's going on in this market, what's going on here. We've seen today a lot of really interesting campaigns. You could immediately in that process just find out what are the pain points when buying a car, what do people think about cheating in gaming? What do people think about the German national football team this summer? All these kinds of things which you can constantly ask. And I think what that enables, because you can ask that the whole way through that process, it kind of creates a sort of a culture of curiosity within the teams, that they can constantly challenge those ideas, test them out, and constantly be trying to pull that back to remembering that market bit. So I think it's just at the start of that process where you say, oh, this is what's going on, these are the market goals, right, and the creative bit starts. But actually, if you can pull that all the way through and constantly be bringing this back and constantly asking those questions, I think it really helps to drive that creativity, and there's a real support for that creativity through the whole process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the short answer is yes, it is measurable, like you said as well, depending a bit on the definition, of course, right? And I really like the definition of new, surprising, valuable, because those are things that we can also measure within the consumers, within our respondents, quantitatively, qualitatively. We can see, are we creating that reaction that we are looking for? Are we making that emotional bond through the piece of creative that we have? We as researchers, we are not the ones creating the creative. We are the ones trying to understand how it resonates with the consumers. And that we can do very, very well. And not only that, but we can also see that there's a value in creativity. We have done a global meta-analysis of all our pre-testing data, and we see that work that is actually seen as creative has a higher chance of succeeding. So sticking out of this sea of sameness, we mentioned it a couple of times today, and having these really great campaigns that we saw today, as you say, it's not an art show, but it is something that we have a business goal attached to, and we see creativity helps in achieving these goals as well.
But when I look at, and you just said it, there's quite a lot you can measure. When I saw all of these case studies, it all ends with, you say numbers, 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 all of those measurements you had. And then Harjot, you're sitting there with your client, and he gets nervous and asks you, what shall we measure? Yeah. Shall we measure from the beginning? When shall we start with doing the case study, having a videographer on the side as well? What is your job in this time and age also when it comes to measure a campaign?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first thing is creativity in so many ways, if not always, is a response. So what Mintel offer are very interesting ways, a premise out there that what can I have an interesting, fresh response towards? So that's one way. And the second way is what you do, which is like, how's it been received? Those are the ways, it's just the beginning and the end. But your question is, like, how do you actually decide what to measure? And I always say to clients, the easiest way is to understand just one thing. It's not about doing the right things, it's about doing the right things right. So really understand what the priorities are. And it's very clear for us. We have to have very clear and measurable objectives. So for example, if the idea is to grow share, or if the idea of the objective is to change a conversation, those objectives have to be measurable, and they have to be informed by some kind of an understanding, because that is measurable. When your understanding is informed, you can measure what your accomplishment against that is. If it's just a hunch, it's really hard to measure. So the first thing is to actually really kind of force that discussion. The second thing to measure is just how interesting is your response? How brave and interesting is that? That can always be measured because there are benchmarks for that, as to what's moved the needle. Ipsos are brilliant at doing that. So what's moved the needle? What's created a conversation in the past that's completely changed the dynamic of the category? You can actually measure that. And then the last bit is the bit that everyone gets hung up on for all the right reasons. Well, what is the actual impact on my commercial KPIs? And nobody ever makes advertising just to kind of have no financial return on it. I don't believe that that's true unless you're a charity, and then you want different kinds of returns that can be financially, codified. So that's really the last part. But I think they all have to be connected, and that's what we do. When I sit with clients, I'm like, let's be very clear about the objectives. Let's be very clear about the parameters against which we'll measure the bravery of the approach, and let's be very clear of the way in which we will assert causality. Like, this work created these outcomes on these KPIs.
And when you're so clear with the client, do you get him then there that he, if that is the answer to the question that we have at the panel, that it is creativity, that it is what moves the needle? Is it that what it is?
Always, without a doubt. Because if creativity, I think, from what I've learned from having been in the industry for 25 years, is one thing, that it's your ability to reimagine what's possible. That's what I've learned. It's the simplest thing I've ever learned is from all of this, is that if you can reimagine what's possible, that's creative. So you cannot accomplish anything if you're not in a position to reimagine what the problem is, what the right solution is. So yes, it will start and end with creativity. So the more you can apply with level of depth and rigor the ability to reimagine, well, what are the ways in which we can actually crack this? Then the work is going to deliver on that. So you can't go and say like, well, we want to accomplish this, let's just buy more media dollars.
Yeah, and you said there's proof when it comes to Cannes Lions, and you can see a difference between shortlisted and Grand Prix and goal winners on the effectiveness. So I want to do one thing, because I had the chance to talk with you before. Who here in the room does know the campaign Dove, Turn Your Back, where the people turned their back towards the filter, the cameras on Instagram? Does anyone know this campaign? Okay, maybe we have to talk a little bit more about what the campaign is, because when Harjot now tells you this campaign, I saw it often, very often. Then we had the call, and you explained me what also was the effect and the ROI behind it. It opened my eyes. Could you please share this with the audience?
So I don't know if you remember this, but a while ago, there was a TikTok filter called Bold Glamour. And Bold Glamour is just this filter that completely changes the way you look. So everyone was posting these photos of themselves, which is like Bold Glamour. So it's a very unrealistic beauty standard that it almost kind of, imposes on you, and then you kind of accept it, put your face out there and say, well, this is me, Bold Glamour. And what most people did during that time is, the way to kind of respond to this is to get on the bus and be like, well, how are we going to kind of create the right kind of lighting, and how are we going to create more cosmetic products and beauty products that allow you to actually look like that? But what I thought was very interesting in the way Dove actually approached this is, one, you start with the truth that's at the heart of your brand. If they're about real beauty, or if they're about not kind of like feeding into these unrealistic beauty standards and celebrating that which is authentically you, and not made up. So their whole thing is, we're not going to like pretend this doesn't exist. We're going to respond to it in a way that aligns with the way we see the world, the way we project And their whole point was, we're going to turn our back on it. So when everyone's turning their face forward to the filter, they actually turned their back on it. They had a bunch of people just turn their back on it. And guess what you see when you turn your back on the filter? You see the back of your head. And they use that to sell more hair product than anyone could possibly imagine. So it's really kind of tapping into a thing which is like about facial beauty and about this idea of like bold glamour, and you're using that to totally change the conversation. One, about turn your back on this filter because it's unrealistic. Teach your daughters and friends that this is not something you need to serve. But in doing so, which is, you would argue, a kind of a altruistic or a noble pursuit, they also made a shit ton of money. You know, so I think that's when, well, an example of when we do our best, we do work like that.
And often when I sit in Cannes, Timon, I look at those cases and I think, in Germany, often when you talk to clients, you have this feeling that they're not so risky, they're not so bold, when there comes a really creative idea that could win a Grand Prix or Gold Lion, it takes a lot of effort to prove that they should do it. And then I looked at the claim of your website where it stands that you can be better when you are sure. And we talked before this. So in Germany, especially here, does it help when you talk then to the client and before and show him numbers and give him some kind of proof into the creative idea?
Yeah, short answer, yes. But maybe to elaborate a bit, I don't know if it's a typical German challenge, and I don't know if I would say afraid of taking risk or something like that. But what we, of course, need to understand that a lot of these marketeers, a lot of these brand people, they are very bold. They are very trying to do something new, trying to do something very, very courageous, actually. And the thing is that if you have a brand, an established brand, even more, that's a very valuable asset. You can't just tear everything down and say revolution and we start anew, right? And that's not going to work. So you need to be sure, you need to be reassured that what you're doing is actually working towards the intended goal, towards the intended business goal. And that can be sales, but that can also be image development, an evolution maybe of a brand. And for that, it's very, very important to have that certainty to understand that you as a marketeer, as a brand manager, are on the right track. Maybe you are not your target. The topic of diversity in the boardroom is always a challenge. But also internally, you need to convince other stakeholders who might not like this idea, who might be more on the conservative side, who might, let's not be too risky. You also need to have the arguments to talk to them and say, no, this is a good campaign, this is a good idea because of this and this reason. And that can be the creativity, but that's also because we know that the impact among consumers, among our target group, will be as we want it to be. And that's, of course, something where, we very surely can say you act better when you're sure, and you can act more confident when you're sure.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting in our industry. I imagine it's similar in any kind of commercially creative industry. We walk a tightrope where it's this constant, we talked about this, there's this constant tightrope between assuring some level of, and exciting with some level of possibility, and then kind of assuring you with some level of certainty. This idea of how do you balance possibility and certainty on a daily basis? And that is the tightrope we walk in this industry because there is such little room for error now more and more because mistakes are increasingly expensive and the industry is increasingly competitive, as is the environment. So the kind of tolerance that we have to not get it right is also at its all-time low. So we've got to get it right, and we have to be exciting. And that's why I think, things that Mintel do are just invaluable because there's fodder over there to kind of find something that expansive and exciting and then some level of certainty from this. So I do think it's a unique industry situation for us.
But, yeah.
We also, I remember we saw it in one of our cases very specifically for the BVG, now then in English, where they explicitly said everyone supporting one of these campaigns was putting their job at risk. If it's not working out, your neck is on the line, and you better be sure.
Yeah, but especially when your neck is on the line, and in Germany we say, man kann die Füße nicht stillhalten. You cannot stand still with your feet. You start your campaign, and you're often on digital platforms, so you get immediately a response from your customer. And then you sit there and you think, oh, should we react? Should we do something else? Should we do another? Should we go also out of home? Should we do something else with our campaign? Should we change the artwork or so on? So what then? With all what you measure, with all what you see with the target group, should you immediately respond? Or should you just wait and see what's going on and trust the process?
I was going to say, well, I think it comes down to partly if you know what you're talking about. Right? So if you've got the research, if you're confident in the market and you've kind of done the research and you know how consumers are going to respond, and you're confident, hopefully you've done that legwork, you've made the argument, you've had those internal discussions, you know how this is going to play out, and then hopefully you can let that play. At the same time, there's a balance, because inevitably, like we've seen with a lot of the campaigns at the moment, there's a kind of cultural element to them. Right? Rarely are they just, now just a TV ad campaign that just runs. Inevitably now it goes online, it goes on social media, and so therefore you have to accept a level of letting it go out there, and the kind of culture will take it where it goes, and I think it's probably more a question of the Harjot, but it's something that you have to embrace a bit. I think that's part of the plans. Quite often, you see where it goes. You can never fully control that. If you're confident with it, you might let it go. I like the Adidas advert where you had the 2 days of shitstorm in the before the advert, which I think is a great example of just putting it out there, letting all that go wild, and then but being confident that then you've got an answer to it, and actually using that response to it. I thought was absolutely fascinating, and I think that's so true that if you've got that clear vision up front of what you want to achieve, then hopefully you can polish through it. It might just need maybe a bit of tweaking, a bit of edging, depending on where it goes, but yeah, it's important to read a little bit, I think.
Harjot, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I would add just one thing, which is that what's very interesting, and I think for me personally, I've been in the industry long enough to see the change. There was a time where you actually could control, to a much greater extent, the narrative that you wanted to establish, that you wanted to kind of, put out there, and all of that. We lived in a media model that was what we call the one to many. There was one big thing, and there were many people out there. You could control that. You could turn up the volume, turn it down. I think we've gone like, what's it now? Many to many, like everyone's a media channel. So you can't pretend that doesn't exist. So you've got to do both. You have to have some assets out there that you can control. And that's why it's so important to come from a place of truth. That what is it that you believe in? What is it that you are undeniably associated with? And then that's your center of gravity. You have to have. We always talk to clients and say, what are the assets that are about that part of who you are? And then, of course, you can't not be successful if you don't inform culture, if you don't blend in, if you don't live in culture. You have to let go. So we have to have both. It's a real ecosystem approach now. So there are sometimes those moments where like, oh, let's just stop everything, let's just change everything. I think you have to take a case-by-case situation. If you have, for example, in the UK, you remember the Heinz ketchup work that sort of went off the rails because it inadvertently may have pushed forward a racial trope, and that had to stop immediately, and you had to immediately kind of optimize and change your assets. Sometimes you let things stay because you want that to become part of a conversation. So I think you have to take a case-by-case evaluation.
I think that's a very, very important point because, again, it's sort of a tightrope, right? You should not overreact. A new campaign, new tone of voice, new visual style, maybe it needs time, it needs consistency. Consumers need to learn it. We talk about creativity, about advertising a lot. We think about it a lot. Consumers don't. It's a low involvement situation that they're in, right? And if we change something, if Red Bull were now to change their visual style, that would take time to catch on with consumers, regardless of whether that's a good idea or not, right? But we would need to give it that time. But then it's important to really understand how creativity and how advertisement works, to understand, are we in that situation, or are we really somewhere where we are fundamentally have a challenge, have an issue with the campaign, and we need to act?
especially with the title that we have, we say the more creative, the more effectiveness. So you anticipate if you have a really great artwork out there, really great creative work out there, you will have some effect on the consumer out there. It's just not often that you can say what is the right effect, right? So often they take your campaign and they do with it what they think is right, and you just have to trust the process. And is this now easier with all the tools that we have, with all that we can measure, that you can see effects on the target groups and so on and so forth, that you know where their standpoint was before the campaign started, and then when it's in the market, that you are more sure that the effect that you see on your campaign is the right effect?
Anyone can say this. What we've learned from the kind of, because we sit at a different, from Mintel's experience in this would be quite different, Ipsos would be quite different. From an agency network point of view, where we said, you have to be vigilant. That is one thing. So vigilant in all three stages. One, where you're setting the vision and saying, well, we want to measure impact against these objectives. This is where we want to see effect and impact, because nobody puts out there and say, let's just see what happens. That doesn't happen. So that's one. So those have to be very well thought through. The second thing is also being able to kind of have an eye on in real time as to what's happening and where the trends are going, what's likely to happen. And then be able to know just exactly, okay, well, how is it kind of delivering? If the KPIs are purely commercial and they're about wanting that much share, that much profitability, you have to constantly, obviously, look at that as well. So you never really stop thinking about the effect. It's a continuous exercise. It's like, I guess it's a bit like breathing. You don't say like, I'm going to exhale and then just wait 20 minutes. It doesn't work like that.
Thomas?
Yes, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think it's just a case of being constantly on top. And I think it comes back to what Harjot said earlier about making sure those KPIs are clear at the start and are properly measurable. So if you know those KPIs are measurable throughout, then you therefore know what you need to be looking at throughout that process in order to measure whether that creativity is being effective or not. If you don't know that, then you've not set those KPIs correctly at the beginning because they're not properly measurable. So making sure you've got that in place and then tracking it through, and like you say, it's just something that's got to be continuous, really, to make sure that's effective.
One last question, because I looked at the time, and maybe someone here in the room want to take his tiny chance and ask a question to you as well. So, often discussed, is it possible to be too creative?
You know what I think?
Is it possible, Harjot?
I don't believe in that. There's no such thing.
Yeah, you need no mic for saying that. And from the guy seeing all the numbers, is it possible? Now is your chance to start a fight on stage.
Exactly, let's do that. Well, too creative, yes, potentially in the sense that we lose sight of the brand, of the purpose, right? Being creative for the sake of creativity, because we always wanted to do something like this, but we forget why we're doing it. Then I would say it's too creative in a sense, yeah. That would be possible.
Yeah, I mean, I would add it probably comes down to how you define creativity, right? So I think, in theory, you could have something which is incredibly creative and isn't very effective, is essentially art. I think, to many ways, I think effectiveness and creativity is what makes the marketing industry. If it's creativeness with effectiveness together. The two are almost the same thing. And in many ways, the most creative solutions, like the Dove one's a great example, where it's creative because it's effective. Does that make sense? So it's not, if it was just on its own, it was just videos of people turning their backs, it wouldn't be particularly, it's a creative idea because it's a really clever idea at answering the KPIs that were set and the objectives of the business. So it's a simple idea which is very creative because it's effective. And in many ways, I think there's often this idea that it's easy to think that the effectiveness, the measurement bit, is kind of the limiting factor on the creativity. You know, we can't, if we could just do whatever we wanted, it would be, that would be better if we had unlimited funds. Whereas actually, I think often those boundaries can make things even more creative. You know, you often find that where if you put more boundaries and say you can't do this, you can't do that, it actually creates more, it generates creativity. You know, it forces people to think, go down different avenues and come up with different ideas. So I think creativity and effectiveness are kind of inextricably linked. They're almost two sides of the same thing when it comes to marketing. So is it possibly too creative? I think it sort of depends on
right. I think
semantics.
It's really important. One thing I would like to say on this is, and I have had this conversation with clients, one thing I would like to say is, it's really important that we use these words carefully as well, because words are important. You know, so for something to be regarded as creative, it has to have utility. It has to have an end objective. It's the whole basis and premise of creativity has utility and value embedded in it. Otherwise, it's artistic expression. So the question is, can you show me one client, and I'm happy to talk to them, who tells me, oh, it can be too valuable, it can give me too much of it might generate way too much value for me. It might generate way too much of an impact for me. It might make me too much money. Like, I haven't met a client like that.
No.
So the minute you kind of talk about creativity as something that is in service to creating value, that's when you ask yourself, is there such a thing as too much? You know, I think it's really important that we use those words and consider what we mean by that, because in this industry, we're in the business of changing how people think. So we have to be very careful of the words we use ourselves.
Nothing to add to that. I think we're good.
Then I think we are good.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. It was a great, great pleasure.